Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with you. I think I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of my father's story and introducing myself. Should we jump right in? I can see four of you. I understand we've got a full classroom this morning. Before I do that, I can see four of you. I heard two of your names. Do you want to tell me who you are before I jump in and talk at you for a couple of minutes?
I'm Allison.
I'm Jenny.
I'm Taryn.
I'm Patrick.
Hi. It's so nice to meet the four of you and everybody else who I can't see who's off screen. Welcome and thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm so delighted to learn a little bit about your class and to meet your fabulous teacher. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen and then I won't be able to see you for a few minutes. So if you need anything, you're just going to have to speak up. We'll do that Zoom thing where you have to talk at me. Okay, so please don't be shy. First, I'm going to share my screen and make sure you can see it. And then I thought I would share a little bit and then come back and we can have some conversation if that's okay. So let's get these going. Okay. Now I can't see you, so somebody will have to let me know. Are you able to see those slides?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again so much for having me this morning. I'm Jessie Ramey. My pronouns are she, her. I direct the Women's Institute at Chatham University, and I teach history and gender studies. So these historical topics are really important to me, and I'm just so grateful to the Holocaust Center for giving me a chance to come and talk with all of you and answer some of your questions, particularly about a topic that's really actually personal to me. So thank you again for having me. So I'm going to tell you today a little bit about my father, Bob Ramey. He was born in Peoria, Illinois on April 1st, 1925. And in high school, my father was really concerned about the draft. So World War II was raging and nearly every young man was being drafted. And my dad thought he could actually potentially delay or perhaps avoid the draft by going to college. Sometimes if you were in college, you could delay or avoid getting drafted. So he actually never graduated from high school. He left early and he went to Purdue University during what would have been the last semester of his high school years in the winter of 1943. But the minute he turned 18, he immediately got drafted. And this is actually a photo of him visiting his family before he left with his mother and his sister looking pretty miserable there, holding on to him pretty tightly. He served in the 89th Infantry Division, which wound up playing a really important role in the liberation of the camps. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. His division landed on the coast of France on January 21st, 1945. So this is in the middle of the winter. Their medic was killed almost immediately after he stepped on a landmine on a tennis court. And my father then became the medic for his unit. He had absolutely no training, but they made him the medic. He's in the center of the photo there on the right, holding his medic helmet. And you can see the Red Cross armband that he's wearing in both of these photos. So the 89th Infantry Division moved through France and into Germany during the winter of 1945. They had to cross two major rivers under major fire from the German army. The Americans actually had to build a pontoon bridge to get across the River Rhine, and that river crossing became very well known. There were songs written about it. These are actually some pictures that were in a scrapbook that my grandmother made for my father. It was pretty common for families back home to keep scrapbooks for their sons who were away fighting. They'd be clipping out news stories and such. These particular photographs were probably taken by an official embedded photojournalist who was traveling with the 89th Infantry Division. My dad's not in these particular photos, but it is his division, and this is probably what it would have been like for him. So those are a couple of pictures of the division going through these small German towns. Here, they're clearing some towns here. They actually had to fight through small towns and clear them of German soldiers. So these two photos were the first two that my grandmother included in the scrapbook, showing tanks rolling through these old towns and these cobblestone streets. Just give you a sense of perhaps a little bit of what that division saw. These are photographs of my dad with his unit as they made their way through France and Germany. My father actually got frostbite on his feet from the exposure living in the camps all winter, and his feet got cold for the rest of his life. When I knew him, they really bothered him. So I'm actually going to share some photographs now from my father's scrapbook that are really hard to see. So this is a content warning. So on April 4th, 1945, the 89th Division came to Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of the very infamous Buchenwald concentration camp. Ohrdruf was the very first Nazi concentration camp that was liberated by US troops in Germany. And photographs of the atrocities there really became an important part of the war effort, which I want to say more about in just a moment. Ohrdruf was a forced labor camp. There were actually over 10,000 prisoners at this point, and the people were made to work on railroad construction. But with the American troops advancing so quickly, the Germans decided to abandon the camp, and they forced almost all of the prisoners on death marches to Buchenwald. The SS guards actually killed many of the people who remained, who were too sick to walk. And when the American soldiers entered this camp, they found the decomposing bodies of hundreds of people who had been murdered, along with survivors who were starving and in desperate need of medical help. The photos here were actually taken by someone that my father knew personally, who sent them to him probably after the war. They were hand labeled on the back by the photographer, who is actually the man standing in the center photo at the top. He's walking by shallow graves in that photograph. That's what that is a photograph of. These are very likely the very scenes at the camp that my dad saw, including the stacks of bodies, the charred remains of bodies that the Nazis had set on fire in the twisted railroad ties there at the top right. So these are probably very much what my father saw at Ohrdruf. A week after the 89th liberated the camp, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, General George S. Patton, and General Omar Bradley visited Ohrdruf themselves. They came personally to this camp to see firsthand what the Nazis had done there. They were so upset, they actually had trouble going into the buildings and reportedly threw up at the site. But they knew that people were already starting to claim that the Holocaust was not real, and that photographs of this camp and of these atrocities would be really important to helping the whole world see what was happening. So the photographs that I'm showing you right now were actually taken by photojournalists and were part of the war effort to show the world what was happening in these camps. After the war, my dad came back from Europe and he went to Yale and Northwestern on the GI Bill. He worked at IBM in the 1950s. He actually developed some of the world's very first computers. And he came to Pittsburgh to study computer science at Carnegie Tech, which is now Carnegie Mellon University, with Alan Newell, who's considered the father of artificial intelligence. So my dad actually stayed and worked as a computer engineer for his whole career at Carnegie Mellon. And he was a gentle man. He loved animals. He loved his family. He liked to build things and solve math problems and do engineering puzzles, just to give you a sense of who he was. He had 7 grandchildren that he got to know before he died in 2009, including my oldest son, who's in those top 2 photos. They share a birthday, so they have a very special bond. And there's just one more photo that I want to share with you. My father he didn't really talk about the war, and he didn't stay in touch with anyone from the war. He never joined the VFW or went to any veterans events. It really was not part of his identity in any way. He had nightmares from time to time, but he wouldn't talk about it, even with my mother. He once told me, "I fought in that war so you kids would never have to fight in another." But in 1995, he went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and this was just about 2 years after the museum had opened. So it was still very new. And it was the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. And my dad was so touched and so moved by the tribute to the liberators. That's a photo of him holding the 89th Division flag with the rolling W of his unit. My mother said that trip really helped him feel better, and he almost seemed to relax a little bit after that. So I'm very grateful that he had that chance to visit the Holocaust Museum and sort of have that closure. Okay. I am going to stop sharing. And come back to you and see if I can answer any of your questions. I hope those were helpful to give you a little sense of who he was.
Just right off the bat, thank you for sharing your experience with us. Thank you for sharing about your father. It was a really enlightening experience, and we're always glad to further our education about the Holocaust.
So the first question we have is, describe what your father told you about his initial thoughts and reactions upon entering the camp.
Yeah, so as I just shared with you, he really didn't talk about the war. It was very upsetting to him, I think, as an experience. The photographs that I just shared with you came from a scrapbook that his mother kept, my grandmother. And this was not something that he shared with me. These were photographs in a scrapbook that I saw later, but these were not experiences that he personally wanted to talk about. But those photos that I did share with you of the camp, I believe are the scenes that he saw. So I think when we're looking at those, we have to imagine his thoughts and reactions, and then understand that it was so horrible that he was not able to talk about it later.
In addition to what your father saw, can you speak about like any certain memories that he recalled about what he heard or felt or smelled like at the camp?
Right. So again, since he didn't personally share those with us because it was so upsetting, I believe, the photographs again that I shared with you just a moment ago were taken by another member of his unit. They are hand labeled on the back, and then I believe sent to my father after the war. So from what I can gather, those would have been the very scenes that he also saw. So I think what we can say is that he quite likely encountered the scenes of the murdered prisoners, the stacks of bodies, some of which had lime poured on them, some did not. The Nazis had murdered people and tried to burn bodies when they left, and there were very shallow graves. We could see that in one of the photographs. There was another photograph there of bodies and a bunch of the twisted railroad ties, again, that had been set afire. We know that there would have been a lot of nauseating smells of charred bodies and decomposing bodies. And the horrific sights, right? So horrible that even a week later, these famous generals, when General Eisenhower, General Patton came to visit the camp, they couldn't even go in the buildings to see these things. And they did reportedly throw up. That it was so upsetting. So I can only imagine what these 18 and 19 and 20-year-old young men saw and smelled.
So we're not a whole lot younger than your father was when he was liberating the camp. What impact do you think that experience had on your father, given that he was still a young adult?
I think that this was almost incomprehensible violence, right? Horror. So horrible that he really wasn't able to talk about it for the rest of his life. So horrible that he had nightmares. And he was such a gentle human. He cared so much about people. He cared so much about animals and animal welfare. I don't think he could ever make sense of the violence and how horrific people could be to each other. So I think he spent the rest of his life really modeling what peace looks like and how do you build peace with other human beings who don't look like you, who are different from you. He didn't preach that, but he modeled it.
So to kind of go along with the last question, how do you think that the experience of being part of the liberation process, how do you think that impacted him later on in his life?
One of the reasons I wanted to share that photograph with you of him at the Holocaust Center in 1995 was that because he didn't really talk about being a liberator, it was not a big part of his identity, right? He didn't go to veterans events. He didn't wear veterans caps or jackets or things. He didn't stay in touch with anybody that we know of from the war. When he did go to the Holocaust Center in 1995, the center had just been open for a couple of years. The museum had just opened. And he went down to look at that exhibit that was commemorating the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. And it was really clear that he was very moved by that exhibit. And it brought him some closure. I think it really brought him some peace. And he was very grateful for that commemoration.
What is the most important lesson that you think your father would want me and other young people to learn from his experience?
So the one thing my father said to me when I did ask him about his experience during the war, he said directly to me, I had two brothers, and he said, I fought that war so you kids would never have to fight another. And I've thought about that for a long time. I've thought about it my whole life, right? It's a really simple statement, but it really is complex if you think about it, right? I think it really is a charge to all of us to think about how to be peacemakers and what does it mean to not fight another war. So how do we prevent war? How do we build peace? And I think that was his perspective on that war, that it was just so horrifying that we had to work to make sure we never had to ever fight another one.
So the next question might be a little repetitive, but did your father ever share his experiences with your family? And at what point did he share? Were you a certain age? Are there certain things that he left out? Just overall, what did you take away from that? So he really never talked about the camps. He didn't talk about liberating the camps. Again, I think it was so horrifying that he was not able to do that. He was very young. He had just turned 19 about 4 days before his division rolled into Ohrdruf, you can imagine. And because he was one of the last soldiers to be brought over to fight in Europe, he was also one of the last to be brought home. So he did talk a little bit about his experiences as part of the occupying forces. They stayed in Germany and they were sort of brought home in the reverse order that people had been sent over. So he did have stories to tell about some of those experiences. But I think the camps were just too horrifying for him to really talk about. So again, the photos that I shared with you today are from the scrapbook that he really never looked at. I think his mother kept this scrapbook. His mother was my grandmother. She lived with us when I was growing up. And after she died, I was in high school when she died. I was able to look at the scrapbook, found it, started looking at it, started asking some of the questions you're asking me, but I didn't get a lot of answers. And I think that's why.
So you mentioned that you kind of looked through the scrapbook on your own, but have you talked about anything that your father went through or showed the scrapbook to your own children?
I have. I think it's important. I'm a historian, so I do really care about the way we share stories and why this history is so important. So I have shared that. And I actually made a digital version of the scrapbook that I've shared with both of my brothers and their families so that we can continue to share that information and his stories. in our family. Certainly have talked about it with both of my kids who are now 18 and 20. So they're just about the same ages as he was when he was fighting in that war.
So I have a question about when they were going into the camp. Since it was the first camp that was liberated, did the Americans and your father like know what they were getting into? Or was it just like the horrors weren't even known?
Yeah. It's a really important question. And I'm not sure how much the soldiers themselves would have been told, within the chain of command, within the military. I'm really not sure if they on the front lines knew what was coming. But certainly general knowledge was out there, right, about this. The world, however, there were people already starting to say that this wasn't happening, that this wasn't real. And I think they knew that. And certainly the generals knew that. And that's one of the reasons that they came personally to this camp. And it's one of the reasons the photographs, I think, are so important. I wondered how you all would feel about seeing those photographs today. They're really hard to see. And sometimes I think we have to be careful about sharing photographs that are so violent that we don't reproduce violence, particularly on those humans, those individual human stories, because I don't have those stories to tell you about the people that were in those pictures. So I think we have to be really careful about that. But the photographs themselves are an important part of the history of this conflict and were used, they had political uses, right, to try to make sure that people couldn't say that this wasn't happening. So that's one of the reasons I chose to share them with you. But I want us to always be thinking about photographs of this kind of violence and how we use them.
I have another question. So you said that he didn't really open up about the events or anything, or like he never really talked about it. He didn't want to make it part of his identity. But were there ever any actions, or like did he ever act a certain way or not act a certain way around like you while like you were growing up, or did he just kind of try to forget the events that happened to have some sort of normalcy?
Yeah, I mean, he really didn't make the war a part of his identity the way that some others chose to. You'll, I'm sure, talk to some veterans, if you have the honor of meeting anyone who's still with us from that era. Some people certainly did make their war service a part of their identity through the rest of their lives. I think he chose not to. I think he chose not to speak of it and to move on, to focus on, building some of the world's first computers and being a computer engineer and doing that work, because that was what was so important to him. And he felt he could give back and do really important things with that work. And I think it was just too hard to try to make sense out of the violence. And to speak of it was just too hard.
Do you think that your father's experiences shaped you into wanting to become a historian, to like preserve all of the knowledge and
That's a lovely question. I was certainly not interested in history when I was your age in high school. When I was in high school, history was really pretty boring and didn't focus on the people that I thought were interesting. I've always been interested in women's history, in history of ordinary people, and even some of the questions you're asking me right now about, sort of ordinary people's experiences was not the way history was taught to me. So I actually hated history in high school. And it wasn't until I got to college and had some really remarkable history professors who showed me what history from the bottom up, and it's called social history, the people's history, and what that could be, that I actually got interested in history.
I kind of feel that way about, I'm very glad that Shaler has such a great Holocaust class, and that Mrs. DePasquale and Mr. Haberman worked really hard to make sure that we get that education that a lot of classes don't teach about.
I think that's marvelous. The more history, the better, right? Women's history, Black history, history of our nation, this important Holocaust history that you are studying. And then you can all come to Chatham and study more history with me.
Are you able to incorporate any of your father's story or Holocaust stories into your work with women's studies?
You know, that's a wonderful question. I just digitized this scrapbook in anticipation of meeting with you all today. I was able to get it from my mother and get it digitized and got some of these slides ready to share with you. So I'll have to think about how I might incorporate some of this into some of the history classes that I teach.
So you said your father didn't really make being a veteran part of his identity. So because of that, why do you think the trip to the Holocaust Center was so peaceful for him? Do you think it was just a matter of feeling appreciated, or do you think it went a little bit deeper?
I think it was very deep and moving experience for him. I know they spent hours and hours inside the museum, which isn't surprising. When I would go to museums with my father when I was a kid, it was an excruciating experience because he would read every single word on every single plaque, and you couldn't get him out of the very first room wherever we were together. He was an extremely smart man. And so he would soak in information like that. So I'm not surprised that he was there probably for the better part of a full day experiencing that museum. And it's a very, very rich and powerful and moving museum. But I think that particularly because they were commemorating the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the camps, I think that meant a lot to him, and to think about it, because it just wasn't something he had been talking about. But I spoke with my mother recently, and she said she really remembers him just seeming to relax a little bit after that experience.